Hi, and welcome to the first of several videos on economics. This video is meant to explain some of the basic concepts of economics that come up a lot in the debate round. It's really intended for debaters. This is not going to teach you all of economics, but it'll give you some good things to think about, some things you might not have already thought of, attach some names to things you might have thought of before, and in general just hopefully make it a little easier to think of these things when they come up and are relevant to an argument you're making in a debate round. So before we get started with actual economics, I want to just give a couple points of general advice on how to view economics rounds. So the first thing is to think of economics not as spec, as just logic you're supposed to have memorized and know from economics class and then, give back again during a debate round. Think of it as logic you actually figure out on your own, that you understand, where you can make logical, deductions about how people will act in different situations and what that effect will be on people in general. I think if you think of it really as this sort of logical argumentation, you will be better at talking about economics, and it'll be a lot more interesting and a lot less frustrating to be in economics rounds. Another thing is that people sometimes get too caught up in the abstractions. It's sort of hard to explain what I mean by this, but in general, economics is the study of how we take resources that we have, land and coal and people's time and skills, and convert them into things we want, food and goods and houses and so forth. And in general, it's the study of how to do that efficiently and how to get the most stuff out of the resources that we have. And it's often lost in abstraction that this is really what we're talking about. So say we're in a hypothetical world where aliens have landed a whole bunch of pre-made, great, ready-to-use cars randomly in the middle of the country, right? And we're trying to debate whether we should use them. And assume we know they're perfectly good, right? You can imagine arguments being made about what this will do to the price of cars and to the car industry and to inflation and various other, complicated economic effects. But what you might lose in that elaborate discussion is the fact that we have a whole bunch of cars, and we don't have to make them. They're just cars that are free and available to us. So that's a great new resource that we have. And it seems like the efficient use of resources must somehow be to use those cars. Right now, maybe that means we need to do something to take care of people who used to be producing cars or something, right? There's other things that might come up, and there's obviously a lot of ways to go about using those cars, and some might be better than others. But in general, it must be an efficient way to use resources to make use of those things rather than to just let them sit there. I mean, this obviously is the same sort of argument that sometimes happens with trade or with new technological advances or something like that. Another thing you should remember is that a lot of gains that can come from certain policies are spread out. So there's often a small effect on a large number of people, and it often comes along with a big effect on a small number of people. In general, people's cognitive bias is to overestimate the importance of the big effect on a small number of people and to underestimate the importance of the effect on a large number of people. Even small effects are extremely important when they happen to millions and millions of people. So don't underestimate those things. Also, don't give undue preference to the status quo. If you're talking about a policy that might change things from A to B, don't think about one as being what's happening now and the other one as the new thing. Just think about them as two different scenarios that might occur, and think about which is better, right? Don't think of negative consequences compared to the status quo somehow being more important than positive consequences compared to the status quo. Now, to get into actual economics. Economics begins with incentives. So the basic idea here is that when you increase the reward for doing something, more of it will be done, right? So as an example, if you increase the patent length that we have in current law so that companies can make more money when they patent things, then as a result, companies will try harder to get patents because those patents will be more valuable to them, and they will, as a result, put more effort into research and development. Right? But this is true not just in terms of making money, right? If you imagine parents who give in to their toddlers' tantrums when toddlers scream about something they want, right? If you give in, then the toddler learns that those tantrums are more likely to benefit them than they thought at first, and as a result there might be more tantrums, right? You're rewarding a certain behavior, and as a result people will do more of it. Now, of course, the opposite holds too, right? If you increase the cost or penalty of doing something, they do less of it. So here you might imagine an increased minimum wage, right? If a company has to pay their workers more, then they will hire fewer of them, right? The benefit they get from any particular worker stays the same, but the cost increases. So there might be some workers who are now not more valuable to the company than their salary is, and as a result, those people don't have jobs. Right? Now, it should be pointed out that this and everything else, right, all the rewards and costs I'm talking about, are only obviously true in isolation. So if you face an increased incentive to do something, everything else staying the same, you will probably do more of it. At the very least, you will do as much of it as before, and it might go up. But there's often more complicated things that happen. So if you take the minimum wage example, if a factory is producing goods that are often bought by low-wage workers, then when you increase the minimum wage and those workers have a little bit more money, it might increase demand for this product, and the factory facing this demand might actually hire more people, and it might lead to more jobs. But that's because this wasn't a change that just affected that factory's incentives, right? This was a change that affected the wages of everyone over the country, and it had other effects. If you were to not do that and just increase the minimum wage for a particular company, there isn't a potential contradiction here. If that's what's happening, if it really just is this change in incentives in isolation and everything else in the world stays the same, then this sort of situation where increased minimum wage might lead to more jobs can't happen. So you have to remember that while this principle is pretty much always true, it's a very simple, straightforward principle about a very particular type of situation, and more complex stuff can come up. Now, there's other examples where we put costs or penalties on things because we don't want them to happen. Something like increasing the tax on cigarettes, right? That will lead to less smoking because somewhere there is a smoker who, due to the increased cost, won't want to smoke anymore or won't start smoking. But there's no one who's going to start smoking because because cigarettes cost more. So overall, this would lead to less smoking. Along with the effect of incentives, we have moral hazard problems, which are the lack of an incentive where one should exist. So as an example, imagine health insurance. As a result of the fact that people have health insurance, they don't have to pay when they go to a doctor, which means that they don't feel the drain on resources that a doctor's visit represents. And as a result, they might be willing to go to the doctor's office over very minor issues that they wouldn't bother with if they were actually made to pay some cost for it. Right? Or they might not be as careful about preventative care, since if something goes wrong, they don't bear as much of the cost as they otherwise would. Right? This is part of the reason that a lot of health insurance plans charge co-pays. The idea is that by making you pay a little bit at least, you are less likely to go to the doctor constantly. Right? Similarly, when the government assists people whose homes are flooded, either by rebuilding them or by subsidizing flood insurance or something like that, then that might encourage people to build in riskier locations that are more likely to get flooded than they otherwise would. Now, it's important to remember that incentives are comparative, right? It's not just about what is the cost or benefit of this action, but how does that cost or benefit compare to the cost or benefit of other actions I might take instead. Right? So if we tax carbon, for example, and make producing electricity through coal or oil power plants more expensive, then that will increase the amount of solar electricity that we produce, even though we didn't change the cost or benefit of solar electricity, right? We are changing one of the other options' costs or benefits, and as a result, that changes how much of the solar energy we want to have. Right? Similarly, if we make something cheaper, like if we subsidize corn, then people who want to eat a roughly constant amount of food will because they are buying more corn, buy less other foods, so there will be less other foods produced. So that brings us to supply and demand. This is sort of the basic way that markets function in a capitalist economy. So the idea here is that consumers are willing to pay up to a good's value to them in order to get that good, right? They decide sort of what that good is worth, and they'll buy it if the price is less than that and not if the price is more. Producers, on the other hand, are willing to charge a price that is as low as the cost of production, but not lower, right? They want to break even. Now, I should say, when we talk about the cost of production here, we mean cost the way economists mean it, which means that we include the profit that we sort of expect a business to get. So if you own a restaurant and, you know, use a building that you own for that restaurant and put a lot of time into running the restaurant, then you expect to make a profit. But what you expect to make is essentially a fair compensation for the time and resources that you put into that business, right? You could have, instead of working at your restaurant, had some other job and gotten money some other way, right? So you have some sort of value you place on your time, and that is part of the cost of production. So when we say producers are willing to charge as low as the cost of production, meaning they don't really make a profit, we are including in that cost enough profit to compensate the producers for all of the effort that goes into the production. Right? Now, if what customers are willing to pay, the good's value, exceeds the cost of producing it, right? What producers require to charge in order to produce it, then that good will get made. And this is the general idea behind capitalism, right? By working this way, we guarantee that goods get produced if and only if the value of having that good exceeds what it costs to produce it. Now, often they're not identical. The value of the good is substantially higher than the cost of producing it, and the gap between those two is what we call a surplus. That's the benefit to society that results as a result of this production occurring, right? We've taken something and created something of higher value with it. Now, the price that the good costs determines how the surplus is divided. So if the price is equal to the cost of production, then that surplus benefit all goes to the consumers, right? They pay only what it costs, but they get the value it has to them, which is much higher. If the price is higher, then producers get some of that surplus, and that's what economists think of as economic profit. Profit above and beyond the sort of going rate of the effort and resources you put into the production. Now, what happens in the market is that if at a given price more people want to buy the good than want to produce it, the buyers compete for the limited quantity of goods that are being produced, right? Someone offers to pay more in exchange for being one of the people who gets that good when there isn't enough to go around, right? And what that does is cause the price to go up. As that happens, some people are no longer willing to buy the good, right? Some of the people who wanted to buy it stop wanting to buy it. And at the same time, producers see that the price is going up, and they either produce more or more producers join the industry, and you get more of it. And at some point, these two effects get rid of the fact that more people want to buy than want to produce, and there's no shortage anymore. We call this equilibrium. It's when the amount being produced and the amount being purchased are the same. And this is what should happen in a free market. Now, if the opposite is happening and more is produced than is being purchased, then the opposite will occur. The producers who all have more to sell than people want to buy, one of them who might otherwise not be able to sell their good will offer to sell for a little bit less, and the price will go down. More people will want to buy, fewer people will want to produce, and again we get to equilibrium. Now, at equilibrium, the price should equal the cost of production, right? If it was higher, right? If the profit you could make from opening a restaurant was more than sort of the going rate to compensate you for that time and those resources, then people would shift, right? Instead of doing those other things, they would all open restaurants. And as they shifted into the restaurant industry, the price would go down, right? So at equilibrium, the price should be equal to the cost of production, which means that surplus we talked before all goes to consumers. Now, as a result of this, any good that contributes more value than it costs gets made, which is what we want to have happen. That means things are happening efficiently. And it's good to think of the price here as essentially conveying information. If you had some sort of centralized economy, someone would have to figure out how much it costs to produce a certain good. And that includes all sorts of things about raw material and time and the time of who and what it's worth and what sort of property needs to be used in order to do it and so forth. It's a very complicated calculation. But the market sort of automatically figures that out, and the price conveys that information accurately. Now, the market also determines not just what goods get made, but who gets those goods, right? The allocation of the goods. And the idea here is that whoever values the good the most gets it, right? Because the person who values it more is willing to pay a higher price for it, and then that price is set so that a certain number of people get it, and those will always be the people who are most willing to pay. Now, whether the people most willing to pay actually are the ones who value it more is a little tricky, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. So, it's now worth talking about price controls. Price controls are when there's some rule that prevents the price from moving as it normally would. So, price ceilings are sort of the most common kind. This is essentially a law or some other rule that says that the price cannot go above a certain amount, right? Rent control reduces the maximum price of apartments. In the 1970s, there were maximum prices on oil. Now, what this does is prevent equilibrium, and in this case, because the price is lower than equilibrium would be, there are shortages. There are more people who would want to buy at that price than there are people willing to sell at that price. And then you end up with people competing to be one of the people who gets to buy it. So in the 1970s, this looked like very long lines near gas stations. People tried to be one of the people who got to buy the oil, right? The gasoline. If prices were allowed to go up, some of those people would decide they didn't want the oil anymore, and there wouldn't be lines. Right? It also can result in black markets, or it can result in people trying to illegally go around the maximum price. Right? Some of those people who are waiting in line offer secretly to pay someone who has gasoline more than they are allowed to pay them in exchange for getting to be one of the people who purchase it. Right? Essentially, they're trying to do the thing that would normally happen legally in a market, but it becomes illegal. Now, you can also have price floors, which are minimum legal prices. There are some agricultural subsidies that work this way, for example. Now, what happens is that there's surplus production, right? The government guarantees some sort of minimum legal price, and at that price, more people are willing to produce than want to buy it. So then there's this surplus production. Sometimes the government has to buy that. Other times, it lets people sell below the minimum legal price, but then pays the people selling enough to make up the difference or something like that. But in one way or another, this essentially costs the government something to maintain. Right? And if the price really is a minimum, meaning the consumer has to pay it, then there are consumers who would be willing to pay the actual cost of production, but aren't willing to pay the higher minimum legal price, and as a result, some surplus that should happen from that production happening doesn't occur, and people in general are worse off. Now, it's worth stopping for a second and talking about how economists see models. So economists model things with simplification, right? These are simplifications that are not really true. They oversimplify reality. They abstract away a whole lot of complications. But they are still useful. So, as an example, let's think about the idea that restricting the choice set of a person can never help them. Right? This is a common argument made, and it basically says giving people more options is always good for them. Right? You could imagine arguing that a college should allow students to design their own major. And regardless of what other concerns might exist, you can argue that this must be good for the students because the students could still do the old thing if they wanted. The only change is that now they get this other option, and if they take that option, it must have been beneficial to them. So they must either have no effect or be better off. Right? This also comes up in debates over legalizing prostitution. Right? The potential prostitute is just by having this profession legalized, being given another option. No one has to do it, and so that means that the people who are doing it must have decided they're better off with it as a legal option than they would be if they weren't, if it wasn't a legal option. Now, this makes sense as an argument, right? If you restrict the choice set, if you take away some choice a person otherwise might have had, then one of two things happen, right? If the best option they could have picked hasn't been removed, then there's no change. They'll still pick that option, everything goes along as before. But if it isn't, then things are made worse, right? They don't have this best option anymore, they pick the second best or third best option or whatever, and that's less good for them. So you can make a very tight, logical argument that says there is no way restricting the choice set of a person can help them, right? But it's not true. So, for example, people often make decisions irrationally. They might not be choosing the best option. If you take away a decision that they are likely to, an option that they are likely to choose even though it's not their best, you might be making them better off. Right? They might not have complete information. They might not know what the real best option is. Right? Or even if they can pick the best option, the effort of determining that, right, might make it less, may take away from how happy they feel at the end, right? Sometimes this occurs in the form of regrets. You can do studies as a psychologist that show that people, when they had a lot of options and they had to pick one, regret not getting all those other things too, whereas if they only had one option in the first place, they feel happy about it because it's a good option for them. So there's all sorts of reasons that it might not be true that restricting the choice set of a person can't help them. But you should see that this is still a useful model, right? This is still saying, in this idealized setting where people have information and are rational and really are just, sort of utility optimizing engines and don't have, sort of irrational regrets about what they did and so forth, this will be true. So if you ever are arguing that it's not, a lot of the debate comes down to how big are the imperfections in the model? How rational are people? Is this a good approximation of reality or not? So it still tells you something about how the world works, even if it's not exactly true in any particular situation. So now that we have that, let's go back to our supply and demand model of how a market works and say, does this model actually reflect reality? And it doesn't. There are a variety of ways in which people don't actually act like this. Sometimes they're irrational. They buy things for more money than those things are actually worth to them, for example. There are transaction costs involved. Transaction cost is when you have to, in order to buy something, pay some sort of cost that doesn't go to the person selling the good. So you have the time and inconvenience of going to the store to purchase it, right? That's a cost to you, but it doesn't benefit the store that you spent that cost, right? So this gets in the way of when the price that the consumer is paying doesn't match the price that the supplier is getting, it gets in the way of the market functioning accurately. Right? Consumers often have incomplete information. It's hard for them to tell which of these cars is actually best and how their value relates to each other, for example. Part of this is that the information isn't available, and part of it is that sometimes it requires doing a lot of research, right? And then that, it means you either accept the incomplete information or you accept a transaction cost, right? That cost of doing the research in order to make the purchase, right? And consumers are sometimes just unqualified to do it, right? A consumer can't, before getting on an airplane, look up the engineering details of that airline's planes and decide whether they meet relevant safety criteria that the consumer cares about. Right? Now you can mitigate this using independent ratings and stuff like that. Consumer Reports tests things, and then consumers look at that and try to decide what's a good product and what's not. But then it still gets a little bit complicated. This is one situation where the government can sometimes help by creating some sort of guaranteed independent third-party agency to do the rating, or to have some sort of minimum quality standards or something like that. So another way that the model can fail is monopoly. So monopoly is when a single agent controls all of the supply, or almost all of the supply. Now what happens here? So if that agent lowers production, then they sell fewer goods, but they drive up the price, right? And by driving up the price, they make more profit on all the goods they are selling. And to a certain extent, they can make more total profit by making fewer goods and driving the price above what it would be at equilibrium. Right. Now, the opposite effect can also happen with monopsony. This is less common, but can occur. This is where a single agent controls all of the demand. And they do the opposite. They reduce the amount they're willing to buy in order to push prices down, which makes them happier. But both of these things prevent some transactions from occurring at the margin and make some of this surplus benefit to society go away. Now, this can occur not just when one person controls all of the supply or demand, but also with collusion, when the people who control supply work together. And you should know in general, monopolies are not necessarily illegal, but there are restrictions on what monopolies can do. So you can't necessarily use that monopoly power in all ways that you might want to. And you're not allowed to create monopolies by merging with or buying your competitors. Now, in some industries, we have what we call a natural monopoly. So this is an industry that, for whatever reason, tends to naturally produce monopoly suppliers. So one way this can happen is what we call high economies of scale. So if a business can reduce its cost by increasing its size, by doing things in large batches, they become cheaper. If this is true, then the biggest company faces lower costs than all the other companies and can charge a lower price, and then that drives more business towards that company, which then can have more scale and charge an even lower price, and so forth, and this continues until they become a monopoly. It can also happen if you have high startup costs, if it's really expensive to get into the industry in the first place. Then the people in the industry already have an advantage. The government often owns or heavily regulates these industries, and there's a couple reasons they do it. So one thing they could do is, by regulating or owning it, they can force efficient production. So when a monopoly otherwise would produce too little of a good, they can force that monopoly company to actually produce more, to not just maximize its profit. Or what they can do is say monopolies are going to produce less and gain this extra profit above and beyond the compensation for the cost of production. But by the government owning that, for example, they can guarantee that that extra profit that normally comes at the expense of consumers goes to some sort of public benefit, rather than to some sort of lucky private owner who happens to have this monopoly. Now, another way in which our simple supply and demand model can fail is what we call externalities. So externalities are effects of a goods production that happen not to the consumer or the buyer. So if there are costs that happen to the consumer, that affects the value the consumer has for it. If there are costs to the producer, that's a cost of production. But sometimes there are effects on third parties. So you could imagine, for example, pollution is an extremely common one. By producing something that causes pollutants to be put into the air, which then harm people who aren't the people who bought the product. There's some other person who happens to live nearby. Traffic is another example. When you drive on a road as a result of having purchased your car, right, you get some benefit and some cost and so forth, but you also slow down the drive for everyone else by causing traffic, so that has an effect on everyone. They don't have to be bad. When we educate someone, right, someone goes to college, then there's a benefit to them in terms of what they can earn as a future employee and so forth, and there's a cost to the college, but there's also a benefit to society overall, because they are a smarter consumer and a smarter voter and so forth, and you can explain in great detail what these benefits are, but the general idea here is that there's a benefit to society outside of the benefit that's understood and felt by the person being educated. So these create inefficiencies because these costs or benefits aren't taken into account by the market. But we can change that by taxing if it's a bad externality, or subsidizing if it's a good one, to simulate the true cost or benefit. So if we if we tax pollution, right, then that polluter facing that tax, sort of by taking that tax into account when deciding how much to pollute, is doing something equivalent to taking that cost to a third party into account. Now, a particular type of externality is a network effect. So this is something that where the goods value depends on the number of people using it. So if you have a phone, that phone has value to you only to the extent that people you want to call also have phones. And this is a situation that can lead to natural monopolies, right? Facebook is a sort of natural monopoly because once it has a lot of people using its site, that on its own makes it the most interesting site to people who then might join, right? Another social networking site doesn't have those people, so even if the site itself is awesome, it's hard for them to get those initial users. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is a collective action problem. Collective action problem is just a situation where each individual doing what is best for them leads to everyone being worse off. So, for example, consider environmental protection. It's in my individual interest to just pollute and not care about what harm I do to the environment, because I benefit from whatever I'm doing that pollutes, and the harm I get from that pollution being out there is very, very small. But there are lots of people out there, and if we all act that way, then we all are hurt a lot because we live in a very polluted environment. Right. National defense is also an example of doing this. It would be good for everyone if their country had some sort of national defense, but it's not in any individual's interest to pay for it. Right? If everyone were to chip in and create a national defense, that would be good, but any individual could not chip in and still get defended through the national defense, and as a result, this is a collective action problem. Another example is basic research. If we figure out some basic facts of science, that leads to all sorts of benefits through technology for lots of people, but unless we're willing to allow patents of very, very basic ideas, which have other problems, then the people doing the research aren't compensated, and therefore it's not in anyone's interest to actually do it or to pay for other people to do it. So the way we solve collective action problems is through some sort of collective decision that's enforceable. So on the small scale, this is a contract. If 5 people would all be better off were they to cooperate than if they were to each act in their own self-interest, then they can sign a contract that says, I will work in the way that is better for everyone as long as everyone else does too, and then a court would be willing to enforce that, and by putting that penalty for violating the agreement in place, it's no longer a collective action problem, and it's in their interest to do what's best for everyone. At the large scale, where everyone is part of the collective action problem, then we call that contract government. That's a bigger scale solution to the same sort of problem. Now there are times, it's worth saying, when the fact that a collective action problem exists is a good thing. So it can stop cartel formation, for example. So a cartel is a group of people acting together as a monopoly, and it's a collective action problem to form one. So say OPEC wants to have a cartel on oil and reduce oil production to drive up prices, because that would be better for them if they all did it. But it's in each of their interest to violate that agreement and produce a little bit extra anyway. And this collective action problem can prevent cartels from forming. So we don't always want to allow, say, the government to solve collective action problems. Sometimes we want to leave them in place, but they're a common phenomenon. This comes up all over the place and should be a concept you're familiar with. I also want to talk about how people value things in the economy. So first, it's worth saying people usually prefer things now. Waiting for things makes them less valuable. Now, how much that is sort of depends on the thing, on the person, but for some things we can quantify it. And in particular, for money, the interest rate determines the value of not having to wait. So if I was going to get $100 in a year, right, that's equivalent to me getting a smaller amount of money now, because I could put, say, $95 in a bank account and have $100 in a year. So we think of $95 now as equal to $100 in a year. people also experience a decreasing marginal utility of money. So what does that mean? Well, it means each dollar you get makes you less happy or adds less to your happiness than the dollar before it. So if you get a chunk of money, right, think about what you would do with it. There's something that you can do that would most add to your happiness with that money. And if you get the money, that's what you will do with it. But then if you get that much more money again, you won't do that because you already did that. You'll do something else. But that something else, by definition, must have been less valuable to you than the thing you did with the first chunk of money. So every time you get more money, the amount of happiness you can get with that money goes down. Now, this is one of the main objections to capitalism's method of allocating goods. Right? Remember when we talked about supply and demand, we said whoever's willing to pay the most money for something gets it, and that's supposed to give the good to the people who value it most. But if some people have a lot more money than others, they might be experiencing very low marginal utility, meaning that they're willing to pay a lot for a little bit of happiness at this point. And as a result, they might be willing to pay a lot for a good, even though someone else would value that good more, would get more happiness from it. So it means that this method of allocating goods doesn't always give goods to the people who would get the most happiness from them, and therefore it doesn't create the most total happiness. Now the last thing I want to talk about is risk. So people are in general risk averse, meaning they don't like to take risks. So if I offer to let you flip a coin, and you will either, with equal probability, gain $10,000 or lose $10,000, the vast majority of people would choose not to take that chance, right? Not to flip that coin. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of what I just talked about, because of the decreasing marginal utility of money, right? The $10,000 that you'd gain is worth less to you than the $10,000 that you'd lose, right? Because as you get wealthier, each $10,000 is worth less to you. So as a result, while this gamble would be an even value in terms of how much money you would end up with, it's a negative value in terms of how much happiness you'd end up with. Now, people try to reduce risk that exists. So they, for example, buy insurance to make it so that if something bad happens, they get some money, right? If you buy car insurance or health insurance or life insurance, right? In general, these things cost you more money than you are likely to get from them. On average, you will lose money by buying insurance. But while you'll have much less money on average, how much you will have won't be as subject to chance. And that lack of risk is worth something. So even if it on average costs you money, it's still a good idea to do for many people. Now, it's worth talking about what it means for a risk to be independent. So a risk is independent if it's not correlated with other risks. So most of the time that people, say, die, is unrelated to whether someone else is going to die. So a life insurance company can sell a lot of life insurance where they would have to pay out if someone dies. But because they have a lot of it for a lot of different people, instead of it being a big gamble where they can't predict how much they'll have to pay out in any particular year, it gets diversified away, meaning that with that whole group of people, you can tell very accurately how much you will have to pay out each year. Now that only works with things that are separate, right? If the main reason people died was huge natural disasters that kill everyone in an area, then an insurance company wouldn't be able to diversify that risk away. So this is part of the reason why insurance companies try to sell policies to lots of different people in lots of different areas and make agreements with each other that spread the risk out between different companies. That's it for this video. There are other videos if you want to learn more about economics or other topics. Hopefully this was helpful.